I'd like to welcome you guys to this week's report. Got a lot of good fishing happening up and down the Southern California coast, and had some pretty decent weather all week long. With that's going to probably continue for most areas through the weekend. The only potential bad spots are going to be the northern Channel Islands and some of the outside stuff like Nick and maybe that tuna zone that's been outside of Clemente. But we'll get into that when I get to those places. So let's go to the map. All right, let's start off by heading up to the Channel Islands. The sea bass bite up that way has kind of dropped off a bit as expected after the full moon. And it's become pretty hit and miss. There's still fish being caught, but I wouldn't go up there counting on getting a limit or even one fish up right now. Boats are finding them. Sometimes they bite, sometimes they don't. They're just doing their normal stuff. So if you go up there, I would just go up there with a plan to, have a fun day, catch a bass, barracuda, maybe rockfish, and get lucky and catch a sea bass instead of going up there expecting to catch them. That's pretty much how it's going to be probably until the next lunar cycle if they're still around. Not much else happening up that way. I know the boats fishing and rockfish up at Rose are doing well, and haven't heard a lot along the beach, but I'm sure that bass and stuff is still biting there. Like I said, that wind is going to blow a little bit this weekend up the northern Channel Islands, so I think Santa Cruz and Anacapa will be plenty fishable, but Rosa might be an issue for private boats. You'll have to check the weather before you head out would be my advice. It's Thursday morning, a lot can change between now and the weekend. Let's head down to San Nick and the Dirt Clod. I mentioned last week that there was probably some fish out there at Nick if some boats made their way out there, and it looks like some boats have made their way out there, and they found really good sea bass fishing over the weekend and through the week here. The Mirage out of, I think they're out of Channel Islands. I'm not exactly sure which landing they're out of. They actually even caught a bluefin on their way back from Nick, so that means some bluefin has trickled up between Nick and Ventura Harbor, which is, pretty standard sign for these fish. But we'll talk about that in the offshore section. That bite is going to be really hampered by the wind this weekend. It's supposed to be blowing 20 out there, 15 to 20, gusts 25 at times. I don't really see any boats making that run out there in that weather. So if you want to go get on that bite, you're going to have to wait till the wind dies down and then jump on a trip. Heading down to San Clemente Island. Bite's pretty standard over there. Yellows on the front side. Seems like it's a morning thing, according to Jeff on the Thunderbird. Said it's good in the morning, then kind of slows down, becomes a pick later in the day, bass, barracuda, stuff like that in a mix of bonita. So if you're going on your own boat, want to get there early, if you're going to fish that front side stuff, it sounds like it's tougher later in the day. Or you can do that in the morning and go fish bass. I had some friends over at the island on Saturday. They had excellent bass fishing. Bass were up boiling, the kelp bite and everything. They're through it per hour. So I might go over there tomorrow, Friday, weather permitting, and take a look. The Navy's got the island closure all weird over the weekend and all week here. So if you're heading over, I'd check the San Clemente Island website before making the crossing or going to fish an area you're not. If you're not sure if it's open or not. So steady fishing in Clemente, heading into Catalina. I fished there on Saturday with my friends Chris Oakes and Scott Smith. We got there pretty early, fished the east end. Good bite shallow on crankbaits, ran up the back. There wasn't a lot of current. The areas that had kelp with current on it bit a little bit early, but then it kind of petered out. Basically, we're just coming off that full moon, and when we have full moon conditions like that, you'll find a lot that the bass fishing is really good early, and then they just stop biting until later in the day. And we had Chris's son's birthday party to go to, and we weren't about to stick around and miss that. So we got there, caught a bunch of fish, and then by 9 o'clock it got real slow, and I think we ended up leaving the island by 11 or so. Wherever you're fishing bass, except at Clemente, it seems like, if you go around a full moon, expect good early, and then it's going to slow down for a big part of the day. They feed at night. I'm not sure exactly. When it's cloudy, they seem to do it, but it's not due to the visibility of the moon. So they get on a weird pattern. So if you're going out in the full moon and you can't go out early, I wouldn't even launch till noon or 1 o'clock, weather permitting, to go out and fish big calico bass. The sport boats, Catalina, are still doing well, getting a lot of yellowtail, bass, bonita, barracuda, and everything. The Pursuit had a real big one, like a 50-pounder the other day, which is awesome. Not the average size fish over there, but definitely something to keep it interesting. We saw some yellows on the backside while we were there off the V's. lot of bait out in 100 to 130 feet of water. Had a spot of puddling fish come up. They didn't want to bite anything. We threw it, and we didn't have iron or anything tied on. We just had bass rods, so we threw some hard baits and junk like that, but they wouldn't eat it. Yeah, I'm not even going to talk about the coast because it's slow. Actually, I am going to talk about the coast. The bite for sand bass, America slowed down quite a bit along the beach. The water rolled, got cold over that full moon. There was a big swell that came through and upwelled everything. One of the reasons I went to Catalina, but my friend Jerry Mayhew ran a charter to Palos Verdes on Saturday, and had really good bass fishing on swim baits, and also one of his clients got a nice sized sea bass, 45-pound sea bass on a 5-inch MC weedless swim bait, and I think like a war lead head, weedless lead head. Those fish are kind of hard to come by up there, but we were coming off the full moon. Seems like a good time for their one to bite up there. He caught the fish in an area where there's been sea bass caught before, so I don't know. There's probably more up there. The divers probably got them all. We've had a lot of free divers up PB this year and last year, just shooting everything that swims. So your chance to catch a rod and reel sea bass, you really need to be lucky up there right now, I think. Nothing else really happening along up this way. Down at San Diego, they're having some good calico bass fishing on their half-day trips. And yeah, really haven't heard much from the Coronado Islands. The boats haven't really been going down there as much. They've all switched to offshore. So there's some improvements in offshore fishing though. So let's take a look at let's start down in Mexican waters. Lots of yellowtail and kelps down there. Even some open water schools. There's Dorado on those kelps. And we're seeing more tuna again down there. It was kind of dry on tuna for a while, but the full day boats switched out, leaving the Coronados, going back out to fish offshore. They're catching bluefin, yellowfin. San Diego had like 30 bluefin the other day, I think. These aren't those real big fish. These are fish getting on flatline baits and stuff, more conventional fishing. And some of the yellows are getting on the patties, real nice ones too. It's not like the little tiny guys, and even the Dorado are decent size. But if you're fishing out of San Diego, everywhere from the border down to outside Ensenada has a shot at kelp patty yellows and Dorado, bluefin, and even some yellowfin. And I know the boats fishing out of Ensenada are back on the bluefin again. So I think another wave came in out of the west on that last moon, and kind of like what we talked about a couple weeks ago. They slide in. And that's filling back in there now. These are not the fish that were up in U.S. waters, the new wave of fish. So hopefully this sticks around and bites for a little bit and spreads things out a bit so, not everybody's gang banging in the one spot that's got fish on and having to make it weekends almost impossible to fish. Heading up to U.S. waters, there's been some fish below Clemente, and they're not getting a lot of coverage. So you're going to have to go and look around quite a bit. The area below Clemente I consider to be the 43 to the 181, 182, 289, the entire Clemente Ridge, all the way up to the Mackerel Bank, which is not below Clemente, but that's all one section of water the way I see it. So that's a big area if you don't know where they are. It's not like running to the 302 or the 371 or even running up to the stuff off the west end of Cat. You got probably 50 miles, 60 square miles to look. So if you go out there, you should expect to spend quite a bit of time driving around. Don't just expect to drive to a spot and find those fish. So I know the 4-pack boats and some of the charter boats have been running out in that general direction, but trying to find a 23-foot park in a 60-mile square area is going to be pretty tough. So you're going to need to go out and find your own fish. I talked about in the past how to go find those things. You just got to look around, run bank to bank, look for color changes, temperature changes, bird life, anything that looks different than it did before. And just make some decisions. If you see something good, just try and be there on the slack tide, late morning slack tide. If there's a slack tide after 9:30 a.m. and you're finding an area that looks fishier than the rest, I would be back in that area at that time. Because that's going to be your best shot at finding fish. So above there, the fish that were outside of Clemente last week slid in between Clemente and Cat, and I think my buddy Jonathan brought this up to me. It's a very good point. He thinks that those fish that were on the beach inside of Cat slid up off the west end of Cat and joined up with those fish that were outside of Clemente. And last week and over the weekend, there was a ton of boats, long-range boats. Everybody was up there doing really well on those fish, which happened to end up being in an area that I talked about that potentially being at this time of year. And I've had a couple of viewers mention that as well, and it's a very good point. These things are pretty predictable. So without giving away too much detail, it's when we saw those fish were outside of Clemente, it was a logical step that they were, at the 499 or places like that, and boats actually went and looked for them and caught those fish. What's interesting about where those fish are currently, or where they were this week, is that boats fishing, sea bass at Nick or yellows at Clemente could slide off the islands and add some bluefin into their mix as well. So they made some fun, really unique fishing there where you can catch. I saw one boat, I don't remember which boat it was, had bluefin, sea bass, halibut, and yellowtail all on one trip, which is pretty cool. Anyway, those fish aren't biting as well now. It's kind of scattered out, or they've squirted off somewhere where there aren't boats on them. Judging by the fact that there was fish above Nick, that the Mirage got one, I would say that those fish might be sliding up to the backside of Anacapa and Santa Cruz Islands. They might be outside of Rosa. There might be fish. There's just nobody really looking in those zones, I don't think. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some fish being caught up there this week. And again, that area above Clemente, and it's basically from Cat to the Osborne Bank to Nick to that 7-Eleven outside of Clemente, outside the west end of Clemente. That's another big area, and those fish aren't really holding hard to structures, so they can move 10, 15 miles overnight, and the boats that were on them don't know where to look for them because it's just a really big area. So I'm sure that once they get driving around, especially those long-range boats, I know the Royal Polaris has been up there, they've got the time to look for those fish, and they'll eventually find them again and get back on them, I think. Yeah, so I think that's about it for the report for this week. But I want to talk a little bit about birds. So I've been, trying to give you guys some fishing information in every one of these videos, and I'm hoping that if you keep tuning in, you could pick up stuff throughout the year for different things that are biting and, technique-specific stuff. But one of the questions I get from guys a lot is what I'm looking for when I'm looking for birds. And that's a good question, and a lot of times it's different things depending on the bird, where I'm at, and what's going on. So, there's basically five basic birds we have here. We have terns, which are the best birds, I feel. We have shear waters, which are also pretty good birds at times. Then the lesser birds would be the seagull and the pelican, and I don't know what the small bird is. It's a little blackbird. We call them gnat catchers, for lack of a better term. That's not their official name by any stretch of the imagination. They look like shear waters, but they're about this big, and they mean nothing. They feed on stuff the fish don't feed on. You see them, and sometimes they hit your boat or you run them over, but they're pretty useless overall. But let's start off with the tern. Wherever you're fishing, inshore or offshore, a tern is going to be actively looking and feeding. Tern is going to be your best indicator of life. So basically, terns have really good eyesight, and they don't mind flying a lot to chase stuff. So they're constantly flying and looking for something to eat on the surface. They can't dive very deep. I mean, they might go a few inches down. I don't know how far a tern can actually dive, but it's not like they're doing what a cormorant or something's doing. And yes, there you go, the sixth bird, a cormorant. But these terns will always be indicative of bait fish on the surface if they're locked in. So these birds are flying high, they're stationary, or they're flying low, and they're actively diving. That means that something is on the surface that they can eat. And if there's other birds around, it's just a bunch of birds diving, that's probably just bait on the surface. If you see terns picking and you're on a slack tide, a lot of times that could just be bait on the surface. And if you're on a day where there's a ton of bait on the surface in general, that could be all they're doing. But if you're not seeing bait on the surface and you see a couple of terns locked in or diving, something is obviously below that bait and pushing it up. So a spot of terns hitting hard and moving them around is a good indication of fish. And when I say moving around, if there's bait on the surface, those terns are just going to dive into it and keep diving into the same place because that bait's oblivious to the terns. Bait's just high and dry. The bait fish tend to look down when they're looking to avoid predation. They're not worried about birds picking them off. So these terns can hit this spot of bait over and over again without there being any movement in the bait. But if this bait that these terns are feeding on is moving, there's obviously something below it chasing it. So now if there's fish under them, the bait fish is going to be moving. So you'll watch these terns. They'll come in, they'll dive, fly ahead a few feet, dive again, and they're moving because that bait fish is fleeing from something. So if you see terns just hitting one spot over and over again or spread out over a big area, just picking, they're probably just on bait. But if they're concentrated and they're moving, then they're going to be on bait that has fish on it. The next bird that I want to talk about is the shearwater. They're pretty lazy birds. They spend a lot of their time just sitting on the water, but they're pretty efficient in their laziness in that they're usually sitting in an area where there's bait fish around. And if you see shearwaters rafted up, that means they're sitting on an area that's got bait fish. So you'll see, when I say rafted up, there could be 5 birds, there could be 50, there could be 200 birds, but they'll be in a group floating on the surface, really tightly packed, or there might be multiple spots of them in one area. And those birds are there because there's bait fish below them, but the bait fish are too deep for them to dive on and feed on. So they're waiting for the tide to come and that bait fish to come to the surface so that they can eat it. Sometimes they're just on bait, and if you haven't seen anything all day and you're offshore and you see some shearwaters rafted up, you at least know you're in an area with bait. But if you want to find out if they've got fish under them, what I like to do is I'll just drive right through them and they get up and fly away. And if they're just on bait, they usually split up and keep flying and go land somewhere else, or the raft them will break up and they'll go fly away or land in groups. If they fly away and then circle directly back to where you drove through them, they're definitely on fish, in my experience anyway, because they don't want to leave where those fish are. And you can also tell when they're on fish as opposed to just sitting on bait if they're sitting, and then they'll all get up and move together about 20-30 feet and land again. And if they're doing that, they're hopscotching along with fish that are down deep. A lot of times, on the same token, if you're feeding bluefin and let's say a little spot of feeders comes up and there's terns and shearwaters on it, and if the shearwaters take off and start going all of them in a certain direction, I would leave the boiling fish there because they're going to chase the school of fish. So if you try and cast to where those terns might still be, if those shearwaters were, you're on the back end of those fish now. And those shearwaters are going to be racing to get on the front end of those fish to get that bait that they're pushing. There's been plenty of times where I've watched it. You pull up on a spot, you see it kind of break up a little bit as you get up to it. Now all the shearwaters are hauling ass in one direction. I will race to get to where those especially if they stay low, I will race to get to where they're going, because when they stop, those fish can be up boiling again and feeding. Yeah, so other than shearwaters and terns, seagulls at times can be helpful. A good rule of thumb with seagulls to remember is that they're just as happy fighting with pigeons for french fries in a McDonald's parking lot as they are feeding on bait fish in open water. So they are very unreliable. They will eat garbage, they will eat dead bait, they will eat something you throw over the side of your boat while you're running by, your sandwich crust, whatever. So I tend not to trust them too much. If there's no terns around, nothing else, I will see what the seagulls are looking at. And that's usually at islands when fishing yellows and bass sometimes. If you see a couple seagulls diving on the front side of Clemente and there's no other birds around, or they're locked in on something, there's a good chance that might be yellows. Or if they're on the edge of a kelp line, there's a good chance that might be bass. But if there's a turnaround, I'm much happier to look at that. In that same situation, when fishing bass, I actually would prefer a cormorant to a seagull. If I see a cormorant in the kelp, cormorants are much happier sitting on a rock with their wings out, thermoregulating and pooping down their own legs, than they are swimming around in the kelp trying to eat bait. So if they're in the kelp and they're diving, they're actively feeding. They're feeding on the same things that bass are. So if you don't see anything else, and all the kelp looks the same, if you see a kelp that's got a couple of cormorants on the leading edge, or a couple of terns looking at the leading edge, it's a good place to go and start looking for bass. Pelicans are completely worthless in every situation. I've never seen a pelican indicate anything. Other than if you cast a jig, they'll dive on your jig and get it hooked in their beak, and then you got to deal with that mess. But sometimes you get mixed bird piles. You'll have seagulls, terns, shear waters, not shear waters necessarily, but pelicans, cormorants, all that stuff. You get a lot around the Coronados, Catalina, Palos Verdes, places like that. You see that quite a bit, and that's never a good indicator of anything. That's just bait that's getting pushed up by a current break or something. All those, they're just in there loading up. There might be dolphins on it, but you never see that with, oh, that's where the yellows are. I mean, years ago down in San Catalina, we used to catch sea bass like that, but that's a very different world down there than it is up here. So those mixed bird piles, for the most part, you're just gonna waste your time. They look great, but they're just garbage. But yeah, so that's a little bit about birds, and I guess that's about it for this week. I hope you get out fishing, and if you do, I hope you have good luck.